Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dublin Book Festival. Our event tonight is on the book Queer Love, which is from Southward Editions. It's an anthology of Irish fiction and from writers from an LGBT background. And we're very lucky here tonight to have two of the authors who have written stories that appear in the anthology. We have Neil Hegarty and Emma Donahue, and I'd like to read a little bit from their biographies, which are incredibly impressive and quite intimidating for a writer like me as well. But I'd like you to hear a little bit about them. For those, I'm sure most of you know who they are anyway, but here we go. Emma Donahue was born in Dublin in 1969 and is an award-winning novelist, playwright, and screenwriter living in Canada with her family. So thank you for making the effort to be here from all the way over there. Her novel, The Pool of the Stars, became a bestseller in the US, Canada, Ireland, and Britain on publication in July 2020. Her novel Room was shortlisted for the Man Booker and the Orange Prizes and sold over 2 million copies, which is incredible. And she adopted the novel into her first feature film, which was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. And there's so much more I could say, but we'll find out more about you when we talk to you in person in a few minutes, Emma. Thank you for coming. And
My pleasure.
Yeah, Neil Hegarty grew up in Derry. His novels include The Duel and Inch Levels, which was shortlisted for the Kerry Group Novel of the Year. Non-fiction titles include Frost, That Was the Life That Was, a biography of David Frost, and The Secret History of Our Streets. Neil's short fiction and creative non-fiction have been published in The Stinging Fly, The Dublin Review, The Tangerine, and elsewhere, and he lives in Dublin. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you guys for tuning in to hear all about our anthology and a little bit about our backgrounds coming from the LGBT community in Ireland, and perhaps that's changed over the decades since we were first wee nippers, and that's one of the things that I'm really fascinated by is just the scope of change in my lifetime. When I was born in Northern Ireland, it was still like been illegal. One of the last places to have sort of the laws changed really in the UK. It was up in the north, and and I just wondered, just to start off with that, going back into your childhoods a little bit. I mean, when were you first aware of your otherness? I was thinking about this the other day. Like, when can you first remember, feeling that sense of difference? Neil, we'd start with you and see what comes to mind.
I can't remember a time when I didn't, and that I suppose is a good thing in that it gave me a nice long lead-in time to sort of get my head around it. I think if you come from Northern Ireland, you're very conscious of being othered or of othering other people as part of the sort of the wallpaper of your life. And this was another element in it. And I think the interesting thing and something which I think everybody, say of my age and a little bit older, is always going to recognize is that you don't say anything about it. You just hold it in your own head and you get your head around it, and then you sort of wait for something to change in your life. And if you're lucky, then it will change. If you can alter the circumstances of your life through education or other means, then the circumstances change and your life can develop, and you can begin to come to terms with all these other things in your life that in the past you've just had to hold inside yourself for the sake of safety.
Thank you. Emma, what about you?
Well, I was a poetry writer at about 7, so obviously it didn't feel very normal, but it was a very acceptable form of abnormality. So no, for me it was at 14, I fell madly in love with a girl in my class at school, and I suddenly felt like, the classic protagonist in a dystopia where you're like, the secret police will come and get me any day now, So I perceived 1980s Ireland as a scary place with things like, moving statues and anti-abortion referenda. And I really felt like I have to keep my head down, not get sent off to a psychologist, not get sent off to the priest. I have to stay in the closet and then escape from this country, which I did 5 years later. So I have to say the period 14 to 19, I was like, I need to get out of here. Since then, I've kept up such a strong relationship with Ireland and been back a lot, and it's really still part of me. But I have to say, those teenage years, I felt like I was, a spy undercover and in danger from Ireland. Yes.
And do you find like part of my experience was that I sort of found out quite a lot from what people told me, or how they observed me, rather than actually me being completely aware of what was going on. It was behavior I was exhibiting, or of choices I was making, of the kind of films I liked, or the music I liked. And they go, "Are you gay?" And I could go, "Oh, am I?" And I just wondered, I do often wonder how much of our experience is shared and how much of it is unique to us, and I just wondered, did you have that sense where other people were presenting you with things about yourself that illuminated things inside you?
I don't remember other people saying things, but I remember making those kind of cultural affiliations. I remember David Bowie was on Top of the Pops, and then the next day somebody said he was bisexual, and I was like, "Oh, he's one of us." So it's not that anybody said to me, "Emma, you look like David Bowie." Oh, I wish. But it's more that I felt these connections, or reading the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Again, I'd feel this kind of sort of beam across time and space saying, I have a secret link with her. So no, nobody spotted a thing about me because I was, wearing long dresses and writing poetry, the kind of, femme veil. So,
Gotcha.
But that's a really good point you make, Paul, about, things like gender and sexual identity. They're all kind of social and relational. They're not just like your deep, authentic inner self. It's always in this complex dance with our culture, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about you, Neil?
I don't think anybody spotted anything. I think partly because I made sure that nobody spotted anything. I think in the 1980s, you'd be running a risk to let anybody know anything about that side of yourself, and especially because the 1980s were such a tough time, from Section 28 and the AIDS kind of hysteria, that all the stuff that was coming through the media, from TV and from radio, it wasn't positive. It was scary. It was a question of keeping your head down and not letting anybody know what was going on in your head. But certainly, I was thinking about this just as this interview was coming up, and I was thinking it does make you a good decoder of culture. You're aware of certain things happening. As Emma says, you're like, this is speaking to me in a certain precise way, a specific way, whether it's music or poetry or other forms of writing. All sorts of culture you get the impression it's speaking to you directly. It's giving you a signal that perhaps other people aren't getting, or they're getting another signal. So it sharpens you up, it seems to me. It sharpens up your sensations, sharpens up your kind of vision and your hearing. So you go, I am hearing something in this, it is speaking to me, and it makes me feel less as though I'm on my own.
I think that's really fascinating as well, about what we want to say, like the kind of the queer ear, because I think that we, when you're younger, it is that cultural thing, but also I think not just when you're younger as well, that you're alert for danger, because I think is it perhaps more pronounced if you're an effeminate boy than with a girl? I'm not sure, but maybe of course girls get called tomboys and boys get called gay boys or mommy's boys, whatever. But there's that thing where you're likely to get beaten up by a group of boys, or you're likely to be bullied, and in a kind of much in a physical sort of way, threatening way, a violent way, and you have to be really, you have to listen for every kind of nuance in the conversation as to what might possibly happen to you. Did you ever have that sort of sense where you had to have like your spider senses going? Emma, what about you as a woman? Did you feel that you had to have that, or was it basically the same way that you felt that you weren't in any sort of watch list of someone?
I suppose my sense of danger, it wasn't so much based on what I seemed like. It was more, will they spot that I'm in a 3-year relationship at convent school? So it was all about, will they spot the same-sex relationship? Because that's the bit I thought looked visibly suspect. But luckily, a lot of girls have these, well, sure, boys too, have these intense pair bonds. You know, I'd be talking to her all day at school, and I'd go home and immediately ring her for an hour and a half, you know, tying up the family phone line, kids. So it was more that rather than people reading me, but I really agree with Neil's more general point that I mean, I hate to boast on our behalf, but I think being somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum is a superpower for a writer. I think it is, like, you know, the best difference you can invest in, because it does give you that spidey sense. And I think I found the same thing about being an immigrant. I immigrated to England and then to Canada, and I'm always feeling a slight outsider and noticing all the tiny little social subtleties. And I think that's a huge plus for a writer. And I would imagine it's the same thing. If you grow up in a racial minority in your culture, you're going to notice stuff that other people won't. So all these things may be uncomfortable to live through, especially if you're 14, but they are such advantages for writers.
Yeah, you sort of scan. It's like a Star Trek scan. You're constantly scanning areas or scanning texts, scanning the society, the community that you're in at any given moment. And you pick up everything from that you need to pick up. And it sharpens you up over and over and over again. You're constantly sharpening yourself up so that you can take in a lot more. As Emma says, it isn't going to be easy. It almost certainly isn't going to be easy. But it's as though you're investing in yourself and in your future all the time, so that you reach a point in your life and you think, oh, it's great. This is great. I feel, I think armored is the wrong word, but I feel enhanced in all sorts of ways as a result of who I am. And of course, it's not a point that everybody reaches. So you have to remember how lucky you are too, how fortunate you've come through it and come through the other side. I thought, yes, I am fortunate. I do feel better as a result of all these things, all these experiences, not easy, that I've gone through in the earlier life.
I mean, I think it's really interesting how we talk about our history and our childhood. I mean, because, you know, I can talk to younger members of the community, and they really are unaware of just how difficult things were back in the olden days, you know, of our childhood, and you know, and there were signals everywhere, you know, telling you that, you know, the way you felt was wrong and who you were was wrong. And I just wondered, you know, for you, what were the sort of most powerful signals that you were getting that you needed to hide? You know, where was that coming? Was it television? Was it your family? Was it religion? Was it, you know, what were the main sort of feelings of oppression about how that forced you to hide yourself and not be yourself? Emma, what do you think?
Well, you know, somewhere loud and clear, one I often tell my kids just to make them realize what a change in the world there's been is that my girlfriend and I were spat at in a Dublin park in 1989. So, you know, I never felt in danger of being beaten up, but we did get spat at. But it's the subtle signals I remember, actually. I remember a teacher at school, he was trying to get us to understand the subtext of a short story in Irish we were reading. And he sort of hemmed and hawed, and we were all like, what's he going on about? And I finally realized, oh, he's hinting that there's something gay going on, but he cannot say it because he'll get in trouble. So it was like this very, very coded discourse. So he was sort of like, what do you think might be happening here? And I thought, he is the teacher, but he's not allowed to say this in case we tell our parents and they complain. So the whole thing felt so sort of stifled. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting too when you consider the absence that there is, that you really don't have any role models. You know, that's completely different today. But when we were younger, if there were role models, you really had to search for them. You really had to look for them. You know, you spoke about David Bowie, Emma. You think, oh, he is kind of cool. Yeah, he is kind of cool. Are there any more? And really, there were very few others. And then in the meantime, you have all this negativity being beamed out. Paul, you asked, and it's really school and religion that there just isn't anything good coming your way. There isn't any positive language or any positive signs coming your way. So you just have to keep everything internalized and just wait and wait and wait.
Yeah.
Which brings us to books, because I don't know about you, but for me, early books that I found were this kind of lifeline. From, I don't know, Shakespeare's sonnets through to, Dickens novels. When I came across little hints of love between women, often from centuries ago, I had this little feeling of like there's always been this kind of secret world, which someday I will get access to. So yeah, I remember things like Channel 4 documentaries as well, but books you could access privately. Nobody knew what you were reading.
Yes.
So I think for many of us, they were very early, life belt we grabbed onto.
Yeah, such a refuge that you can go and you can close the door and you've instantly got a safe space.
Yes.
And that even if anything isn't particularly overt, it's another way in which you can read the signs. You can think, okay, well, I'm seeing something in this book that we're not being taught. Nobody else is seeing it, but I think I see something here, and that's an instant comfort.
I mean, I think, and also I think libraries as well, somewhere like I felt like the safest place in the world, more than the house that I lived in or the street that I, played in or the school that I went to. I mean, I went there for as a kind of refuge, and it was where I found people like me, even if it was in the covers of books. And I found that like a lot of I think a lot of people who feel different, search for that in books. I think part of the reason we read is to find out that we're not alone, and I think that they can be really powerful places. Now, I know I asked you to prepare something to read. I should have reminded you at the very beginning before we started, but I hope you've remembered that. And I'd like to take that little moment now, since we've brought up books, to actually have a little reading from both your works. Emma, are you ready to dazzle us with your feast?
Sure. Is this to be a piece from the short story in Queer Love? Yep, just checking.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So my short story, Speaking in Tongues, is, I suppose, a suitable one for today because it's about a generational gap between an older woman and a younger woman. And in a way, one of the things that's coming up so much today is the generational gap between those of us who say grew up in the 80s and those coming of age today. So let's see. Okay, so two characters called Sylvia and Lee. The reason I got into that van was a poem. I'd first heard Sylvia Dwyer on a tape of contemporary poetry in Irish. I'd borrowed it from the library to help me revise for the leaving cert that would get me out of convent school. Deirdre had just left me for a boy, so I was working hard. Poem number 5 was called Gá Theanga, Two Tongues. The woman's voice seemed to have peat and smoke in it, bacon and strong tea. I hadn't a notion what the poem was about because you needed to know how the Irish words were spelt before you could look at them up in the dictionary, and one silent consonant sounded pretty much like another to me. But I listened to it every night on my Walkman until I had to give the tape back to the library. I asked my mother why the name Sylvia Dwyer sounded so familiar, and she said Sylvia must be the last of those Dwyers who'd taken over the Shan Valley butchers 30 years before. I couldn't believe the poet was a local. I might even have sat next to her in mass. But it was Cork where I met her. I had joined the Queer Sock in the first week at college before I could lose my nerve. And by midterm, I was running their chocolate and wine evenings. Sylvia Dwyer, down from Dublin for a weekend, was introduced all around by one of her exes in the French department. I was startled to learn that the poet was a one of us, a Colleen, as a friend of mine used to say. Her smooth bob and her silver grey suit were intimidating as hell. I couldn't think of a word to say, so I poured her plonk from a box and I put the bowl of chocolate-covered peanuts by her elbow. After that, I smiled at her in mass once when I was home in Shan Valley for the weekend, and Sylvia nodded back very minimally. Maybe she wasn't sure where she knew me from. Maybe she was praying. Maybe she was a bitch. Of course, I had heard of Lee Maloney in Shan Valley. The whole town had heard of Lee Maloney the year she appeared at Mass with a Sinead O'Connor head shave and a t-shirt with women's symbols all over it, like some kind of postmodern Virgin Mary. Then I listened in on a euphemistic conversation about Lee Maloney in the post office queue, but contributed nothing to it. My reputation was a clean slate in Shanvalley, and none of my poems had gendered pronouns. Then in Cork, when I was introduced to the girl, she was barely civil to me, but her chin had a curve you needed to fit your hand to, and her hair looked 7 days old. On one of my rare weekends at home in Shanvalley, who should I see on the way down from communion but Lee Maloney, full of nods and smiles? Without turning my head to her, I could sense my mother stiffen, and in the car park after Mass, she said, "How do you come to know that Maloney girl?" I considered denying it, claiming it was a case of mistaken identity. And then I said, "I think she might have been at a poetry reading I gave once." "She's a worry to her mother," said mine. It must have been after I saw Sylvia Dwyer's name on a flyer under the title Dá Theanga, Two Tongues, a conference on bilingualism in Ireland today, that my subconscious developed a passionate nostalgia for the language my forebears got whipped for. So I skived off my Saturday lecture to go to the conference in Galway. But only when I saw her walk into that lecture theatre in her long brown leather coat with a new streak of white across her black fringe did I realise why I'd been motivated to sit 4 hours on a bus to get there. Some days I have more nerve than others. I flirted with Sylvia all that day in the quarter hours between papers and forums and plenary sessions that meant equally little to me whether they were in Irish or English. I asked her questions, I nodded before the answers even started. I told her about Deirdre, just so she wouldn't think I was a virgin. "She left me for a boy with no earlobes," I said carelessly. "Been there," said Sylvia. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thank you very much, Emma. Neil, would you like to read for a little bit for us, please?
Yeah, I'd love to. Emma used the word generational, and mine is slightly like that as well, in a different way. So it's an extract from my story, Braided River, and the anthology. It opens in London, and it's more or less in the here and now. It's a group of Irish friends hitting 50. They've been to university together in Dublin a quarter century earlier, which is a kind of terrifying thought. And so David Gray is playing as a sort of musical wallpaper to their student days. And it's this music which tugs the narrative back to those long ago Dublin days. So we meet Brian, his boyfriend Donal, and his flatmate Pauline in their flat off Baggot Street in Dublin. They're about to head out for the night, and something pivotal will happen during this night out, which will shadow Brian's life for years to come. The music has shuffled up David Gray as a monument to our youth, now lost and gone forever. And Pauline and I look for an instant at one another across the potatoes. "Leave me alone," I want to say to her, or perhaps it's "leave it alone, just leave it." For already I've noted the ghost or semblance of a younger woman accompanying her tonight, something in the tilt of her chin, the light in her eye, which pulls me back to another framing, another poised moment. The music and the walls that are not now blue, but stark and white. And there's Dublin, just beyond the window. This year's love had better last. Heaven knows it's high time. I've been wanting to call it a night, but now I see suddenly that Pauline has other ideas. She doesn't trill that the night is young because she doesn't have to. The sparkle in her eye tells the story. And anyway, I'm not stupid. The atmosphere in the flat has moved up through the gears just in these last minutes. Hash and dreamy laughter and a state approaching somnolence, I hoped, now transforming inexorably into something else. Crowd will move on, will go out, no tapering off possible now. Instead, it's clubbing, it's inexorable. I've been yawning, thinking of Donal in bed and hoping that Pauline will fall off a cliff, as she sometimes does, will vanish to bed, that the crowd cannot fail to get the message that they leave. But no such luck. Pauline is a hostess with the mostess tonight, and Pauline is moving on too. And sure enough, "Let's go out," she says, and brooking no opposition, we can get a couple of taxis on Baggot Street and head into town. Across the room, Donal, who'd been yawning too just a couple of minutes previously, sits up and smiles, glances at me with mingled mischief and sympathy. Leave it alone. Just leave it, I want to say. And of course, there's no surprise, none at all. For these past few weeks, Pauline has been all about Pauline and Pauline's agenda, even more than usual. She's recently met up again with an old flame from Galway. Cyril is his fellow's name. Cyrils are common enough in the West, you'd be surprised, she said, and has brought him home. And if this isn't enough, she's had sex with him in our building's antiquated lift. Donal says that the lift was surely designed expressly for sex. A dark carpet on the walls and a mirror on the ceiling, smoky lighting, and its inner door can be slid across. And on this occasion, Pauline did indeed slide it across to stop the lift moving between floors. We'll have to try it ourselves, Brian, so, Donal said. And sure, doesn't dark hide the stains? And Pauline laughed. I tried to shut her up or down by mentioning her Galway convent school, but she only laughed again, and Cyril sniggered, and so I said, speaking of Cyril, did you know that Pauline's mama used to collect her and her friends from school, and they'd have to say the rosary right there in the car on the way home? It's true. Donal said, there's street cred for you, Pauline. You must have been the trendy girl at school, were you? And Pauline laughed once more. I'm not saying the rosary much these days, is a fact. Shameless hussy, I said. But there's no need for shame, she said, which is a lesson you might learn yourself, Brian. And so I was the one who was shut up or down. And tonight she's in form. She has an agenda. Her expression says it all. I watch, and Donal turns to her and says, I suppose you're after a bit of carpet burn again tonight, Pauline. You have the look of a girl who is. And Pauline shakes out her hair, and she doesn't deny it. And she turns to the stereo, and she snaps off David Gray, and she says, right, lads. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. Just to listen to you with thoughts, I mean, we're all, I guess, we're of a similar age and sort of background, and I'm wondering now, I mean, what are the biggest changes that you've felt or that have impacted upon you that have gone on in the society's attitude towards us and and the young community that is out there now? What would you see are the biggest changes? What do you think, Emma?
Well, I don't know. I can't summarize them all, but one that springs to mind, and it's not really about society's attitude to us, it's more our own sense of ourselves, is that lots of people I know who identify as lesbian or gay, their teenage children are gender fluid in some way and go by they. So, there's a variety of terms, but I would say that's a huge one. That's a very obvious kind of, difference between the 15-year-olds and the 55-year-olds. Yeah. So it's been fascinating for me, not only to see Ireland change so fast, but then to see what we used to call the gay community change so fast as well. And so, there's a sort of dazzling intersectional array of ways in which things have changed over the last 40 years. And so often nowadays, I turn to my partner and say, like, this is the world we fought for, don't complain if some of the changes take you unawares, because, we were always about freedom.
Exactly. Neil, what are the biggest changes for you and that have impacted upon your life, do you think?
I think it's the absence of shame. When I was writing Braided River for the anthology, it was all about what shame can do to drag you down, drag you back, keep you quiet, keep you low. And it just, I'm not going to say it isn't there anymore, but it's so much diminished. I think when we were younger, it was a potent weapon to keep people like us in their place. It was there in the back of your mind, and it stopped you from speaking up, stopped you from holding your chin at the right angle. And I think young gay and lesbian people just don't have that anymore. Or if they do, it's like a little tiny trace which can easily be scrubbed away. And that's so completely liberating. It means that the tool in that toolbox, or the weapon that was always used against us, just is unusable now. And that's so liberating, it's so healthy. And it means that people don't have that kind of darkness in their mind that I think people of our age would be at least familiar with, even if they didn't experience it themselves.
I think I agree. And I mean, I am aware that there's still many people who suffer, from homophobia and from different kinds of abuse or in relation to their sexuality. And I do think that we hope that so many people are, so what we can see from television and representation, these really confident young people, and that's, I really see that confidence, which I think is a lack of shame, that kind of just dazzles me, but I am also aware that it's still there, those issues are still there. There's still young people growing up with this attitude, and still like the biggest slur in the playground is still "you're gay." That actually hasn't changed. And I do think that, there are also, just to sort of highlight that as well, I do think there are people who are still in pain because of that and are being caused to feel shame. Perhaps they're just given better tools to deal with it, because society is more accepting as well. So and families too. I was just wondering, see, when you're writing, do you feel a pressure or a pleasure in choosing gay characters or gay storylines, because you're sort of either set up as a sort of to represent the community, or because you really want to voice that community? Emma, what do you think?
I feel a definite pleasure in it. I'm also, realistically taking a sort of bird's eye view of my career. It's no accident that the best-selling ones have not been my lesbian-themed storylines. It's just a fact, but I try not to let that stop me in any given case. I've always just written a lot of things, plays, books, stories, films, put them out there and hoped that some of them would find lots of readers or viewers. So I try not to fret over the fact that if I start writing a same-sex storyline, I know I am, narrowing my audience. Not that much. I mean, sometimes if it's not the foreground issue, sometimes an audience will like my most recent one, The Pull of the Stars. I think most people perceived that as a book about pandemic in 1918, and then the lesbian storyline is a bit more incidental. So that probably didn't damage its chances much. Oddly enough, I find in historical fiction, my lesbian-themed works aren't so stamped as lesbian because people think of them as historical. Whereas I think if you write contemporary same-sex stuff, that can be sometimes seen as a sort of a label which can limit sales. But basically, I refuse to care about that stuff. And also, in my experience, it's all a bit random anyway. It's rather unpredictable who will find your book or your play or your story. So you can't try and game the system. You don't really know what's going to be commercially successful, and you shouldn't necessarily care either. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a very rich subject line, and I love writing about it. There's kind of a built-in surprise. I love writing about, love or an awareness of your own identity, taking a character unawares. I mean, characters changing is the meat and drink of fiction. So having people be surprised into something queer is a great storyline, quite apart from wanting to represent a community.
Do you think it's beginning to change, this idea that if you write something which is recognizably gay or lesbian, that you're going to perhaps limit your readership? Do you think that the industry and the readership is changing in any way these days and sort of in the near future, so we don't even have to take that into account?
I think publishing is pretty open to it, but I notice, I look at my own book sales and I'm like, oh yeah, the ones without lesbian content can sell much better, Yeah. So it probably is changing. And it could be that when I write non-lesbian storylines, I'm in a way forced to go for slightly more high concept, meaty stories because I'm not coming to them from this sort of autobiographical angle. So yeah, I think it is changing, but it's still a factor. Yeah. And the same goes for Black writers writing stories about Black people. They find that too. There's an exasperating, lingering factor of people in the majority feeling that books about minority life as they would see it are not quite for them. They're not hostile to it, but it's a bit about, oh, not one for me. So I think that's what we're having to overcome with the readers, is the sort of not one for me mindset.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You have to not try to game any system. You just have to write what comes out. You have to listen. You have to tap into your subconscious and just sort of go for it. When I was writing The Duel, my last novel, there was no sense of choice. There's going to be a same-sex couple at the heart of this. In the same way as there was no choice that this same-sex relationship was not going well, was not healthy, was a bad relationship for one of the partners. It developed organically on the page, on the screen, and it felt absolutely right, absolutely the right thing to work with. I'm a great believer in trying to get into that zone where your subconscious is just going to feed you word after word and idea after idea, and all you have to do is just keep on writing it, and then it'll be correct, it'll be right. So yeah, absolutely. But having said that, when I was writing The Duel, it did feel important for me to wind up that same-sex relationship on a positive note. I didn't want to leave my man stranded in some sort of hellscape with this guy that he absolutely shouldn't be with. So I was really glad not to do that as well.
Yeah, I remember having this kind of feeling where I felt really, really compelled to write a story about a young boy, exploring or beginning to become aware of his sexuality. But then when I'd written the book, I also felt like I was voicing or being some sort of voice. But then when the book was out, I was also really aware that I didn't want it to be in the sort of the gay shelf at the back of our Down library in the far dark corner, where there's cobwebs, and I wanted it to be sort of read by everyone, that it's not this kind of sectioned off tale, not relevant to anyone else. But it was really important to say, well, we're very similar. We're all looking love, wanting love, and finding it in the wrong places, and we're all growing up and having the pressures, as well as the fact that we have this thing. But then I hear other people say, oh no, but it's really important to be on that shelf, and and for them to be on that shelf is like is a massive statement. And so I'm always just interested in that dichotomy, and and the differences in the community of like whether they feel compelled to write a story, or whether they and to be on that shelf, or whether they they just want their readership to be as wide as possible. I just do you know what I mean? I'm interested in that.
Yeah, it's the debate which keeps on going on and on. We have fewer and fewer physical spaces now. Bars are, they're accommodating to all comers, and that's a good thing. But it's in lots of ways it isn't a good thing. And except that in the very largest cities, the gay spaces don't really exist anymore. And the same thing happens in mainstream bookshops. The LGBT shelves in lots of them just aren't there anymore. Our books are shelved with everybody else's books. There isn't any right or wrong to that. There isn't any way of sort of clinching that argument. We're just going to have to keep on talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Emma, any thoughts on that?
Well, luckily, we don't have to or get to choose what shelves the books are put on. That's a librarian's dilemma, or a bookshop owner dilemma. We just write the stories. And I think that the best of our writers manage to write books which feel utterly compellingly urgent to those of us within their community. I'm thinking of some like Sarah Waters, and then BBC are lapping them up as well for a wider audience. So I think if you write the story well enough with no sense of shame or inhibition, and no feeling of like, must tone down the sexy bits, or above all, don't feel like must make it a straight relationship instead. Sometimes if you do that job well enough, that will carry over to a broader audience, because they will be so convinced and caught up, and they'll care about your characters. So yeah, I try not to worry about the shelving issues, especially as nowadays via the internet, people find the stuff they're interested in. You don't have to worry so much about things being literally shelved in the right area. People, if you're honest about the content of your book, people will find it out. So yeah, that's one of those many issues I try not to fret about.
Yeah, I mean, it is so liberating now, especially for younger people or more isolated people, that there are so many sources of information which wouldn't have existed when we were in our teens or early 20s. And that's just, we can go on about the perils and the evils of technology all we like, but in that context, it's such a blessing and such a boon for people like us in perhaps a slightly different situation.
Oh, one exception to, I was saying, like, oh, be honest about what your book is about. But sometimes if there's a reveal in a novel, say, you don't necessarily want to give that away on the book flap. So I don't always kind of highlight the themes that are going to come up in the book, not because I'm being closeted about them, but just literally I want the reader to experience them in the moment with the main character.
Yes. And I think that's where, I mean, what I was sort of slightly driving at was that, especially if you were, when in your first novel, if you're within a sort of a smaller press, and those was it was independent presses, you actually kind of more or less write your own blurb, and so actually you do kind of have a bit of say about where it ends up on a shelf, because really they're just doing it based on what your blurb is. And so I found I kind of got a lot of stealth readers by using that method, but I thought it was quite interesting. What I was interested in asking you both about your childhood favorite LGBT writers, or writers who included characters of LGBT that sort of gave you that feeling, that we were talking about earlier on, where you were finding something out about yourself or a kindred spirit, or that, and I just wondered, did you have any favorites, any sort of authors you'd like to highlight, or books or characters you'd like to highlight?
The first one which came to me, I mean, it's not from early childhood, it's from my teens, when I was reading Jennifer Johnson's early novel, How Many Miles to Babylon, which is not, it's taught as a First World War book, as a sort of classic book of the First World War, and how people, these kind of brothers in arms and the suffering that they had to undergo and so on, and of course class and all these things are being discussed in schools. And I remember reading it in my early teens and thinking, yeah, no, I get all that for sure, but these two guys are in love. They're totally in love. And the fact that one is the son of the big house and the other is one of the guys who works on the land is a big thing. And it probably isn't going to end well. But I see the relationship here, and I don't understand why that isn't being talked about. Of course, it never was. But that's what I mean about a book reaching out to you particularly, and saying, well, you understand, you get the other thing that's going on here, which is a great comfort, I think.
I remember, not so much from childhood, but about a week into university, a gay guy from America who I met in the Gay Society, who got kicked out by his family for being gay and sent to, aversion therapy and so on. But he brought me along to the Abbey to see Frank McGuinness's play, Observe the Sons of Ulster, which again, a World War I story in which two soldiers are in love. That blew my mind. And I remember Mary Renault novels as well. A lot of them being about gay storylines rather than lesbian ones. But I also remember, say, Shakespeare plays. I remember seeing Twelfth Night and thinking like, whoa, effectively this is a lesbian story, but going undercover. So yeah, actually quite a few theatre experiences rather than just fiction.
Any modern writers that you've come across that have sort of, that you've been reading recently, or that have come to your attention through just voicing sort of the modern experience? And I've been reading like Garth Grimwell and Bram Washington, and and people that I've found really fascinating, and also like Shugi Bain, obviously that came out there. There's a really interesting discussion on Twitter at the minute about that. One of the Booker judges saying, that the conversation around it was gay enough, but not too gay in our faces, whereas another book had been sort of sent out because there were sex scenes in it, and they didn't vote that in because they said, well, I wouldn't recommend this to my family and friends, which I thought was fascinating. You're still, that's a literary conversation with literary judges. We're still at that level. But I mean, I was just wondering, was any books or authors who have come to your attention that we might sort of signal for people listening?
There's a new one by the American writer Lauren Groff called Matrix, about Marie de France, the medieval abbess and writer. And that's set in a convent. And it's just a kind of a blazingly confident and original take on the relations between women, including sexual relations. But it's just written with this kind of verve. It's not like lesbian fiction in any kind of, bracketed way. So yeah, Matrix is a dazzler.
Thank you very
I
much.
wish I'm ashamed. I wish I could remember his name. The book about the young guy, the memoir about the young guy in Tennessee, growing up in a very Baptist family and having to. It was made into film with Nicole Kidman a few years ago.
Oh, the one about the conversion therapy, was it? Boy Erased.
Boy Erased. I still can't remember the name of the author, which is terrible. I mean,
I have somewhere there.
Yeah,
I'll go search in a wee minutes and see if I can find.
It's such a shocking read, and it almost makes you count your blessings in a way that no matter what negative experiences one may have had oneself, he can always say, "Well, mine were 10 times worse." But it's
I just looked it up. It's Garrett Connolly.
Yes, Garrett Connolly.
His memoir.
It's a great book and a shocking book.
Well, listen, we've come to kind of the end of our wee conversation, and I wanted to thank you both very much for taking the time to come and talk to us today. And I want to just remind everyone that this is the book Queer Love, and I hope some of you go and buy it and read some of the fantastic stories in there. And those of you who can and have the time, I'd really recommend going and having a wee look on the Dublin Book Festival website and see about the rest of the events that are coming up in the next week for you. There's plenty for you to see, all you book lovers. But once again, to say thank you very much, Neil. Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you for coming.
It's been lovely. Bye, Neil. Bye, Paul. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
All right. Bye. Bye-bye.